Okay, welcome back for this second part of the morning session. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Barbara Barth, who is professor in medieval art, iconology and historiography at the Catholic Universiteit Leuven. Her research project shows an interdisciplinary dialogue with the humanities and deal with the methodological space between text and image, the impact of sensorium in the visual arts, and finally, the critical reflection on the art historical discipline. She is the author of numerous books, articles, book chapters, and edited volumes. Barbara Barth was honored with several awards, among which the most prestigious is the Franke Prize for Human Science that she received in 2016. She was invited as guest professor at numerous universities in Europe, Japan, and the United States. And she is the founder and editor-in-chief of 4 academic series, among which studies in iconology published by Peters Publishers in Leuven. And she will give us now a talk about the iconic gaze, the new lamp by the Van Eycks. Barbara, floor is to you.
Thank you. We'll first do the share screen.
Yes.
Yeah, and then slideshow from the beginning. Okay, thank you so much, Ingrid. And thank you also, Ralph. And thank you, our host, BOZAR, and our ladies, Olga and Anna Maria, to take the technical stress away from me. Thank you so much. When the 16th century overpainting of the lamb on the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb was removed, another animal appeared. The lamb appeared to have not a snout, but more of a face with forward-facing eyes instead of eyes placed on the side of the head. The original characteristics of the lamb were later criticized to be a démarche, a medieval naïveté, which had to be painted over and corrected with 16th century expertise. Nevertheless, Jan van Eyck and Hubert van Eyck had extraordinary observation skills and possessed an unfailing knowledge of flora and fauna. And for sure, masters saw it as their highest responsibility to paint, besides a natural correct lamb, also the theological lamb of the Revelation, including a halo of golden rays. With the Van Eycks, the lamb of the Apocalypse becomes a unique, ambivalent, piercing figure with an almost human gaze, as if it resonates that of the Son of Man himself. The painters did bestow the lamb eyes with one correct zoological detail, however, the typical horizontal pupils that goats, sheep, and deer have. Because they are vulnerable prey animals, the horizontal pupil offers them a broader range of sight. And if Van Eyck's lamb hence sees more than you and me, this optical advantage and feature of the natural correct lamb connects wondrously with a direct frontal eye contact, as if this animal is in an iconographical, theological, and optical process of becoming a human being. Iconographically, the frontal gaze is an important characteristic of the vera icon, or the acheropoietos, that originated in the art of icons. Acheropoietoi are images created without intervention by humans, acheropoios. Often, they are connected to so-called iconogenetic legends, which offer an explanation for the creation of a new figurative image, but even for the arts as such. I will expand upon the example of the Mandilion and the Abgar legend. In the 6th century, the legend of King Abgar of Edessa is born. The Syrian king was a contemporary of Christ and had thus heard of the Messiah. One day, the king falls ill and sends an artist, Ananias, to Jerusalem to create a portrait of Christ. The king believes that this portrait will heal him, but the artist is blinded by the countenance of Christ. In response, Christ himself presses his image onto the cloth, the Mandilion. At first, the cloth did not show anything, but on the way back to Edessa, firstly, blotchy shadows started to appear, followed by contours and finally color. Back home, the peculiar image relic heals the king of his leprosy. In 944, the Mandylion is said to have been transferred from Edessa to the imperial palace in Byzantium, where it presumably disappeared during the Fourth Crusade. Eyewitnesses, we have sources on that in Byzantium, speak of a blinding light that radiates from the Mandylion. Also, the true image was said to be indescribable, in the same way that the mystery of the double nature of Christ is indescribable. Today, both the San Bartolomeo degli Armeni in Genova as well as the Vatican claim to have the most accurate copy of the authentic lost Mandylion. They are both possibly from the 14th century. These mandylia are characterized by the rather dark image of Christ, referring to the living shadow-like image in process to the light, and the eye is placed in what seems to be a template, a round face contour with 3 points at the bottom for the hair and the bird, like a kind of octopus. The eye's pupils are at the very center always, meaning that Christ's eyes optically seem to follow the viewer when they move. The Mandylion of Abgar has captured the face of Christ. Already Augustine calls the image capax, that which is extensive and tangible. The cloth effectuates an iconic transference of the assumed godly origin of images to the human artistic practice. In the legend, this process is depicted quite literally in the different phases of development from a formless shadow shape to the figurative form of the portrait. Because the Mandylion was bestowed by Christ himself, this also legitimized all other icons that will come forth from this ancient source and will flood over the Christian world. Until the 11th, 12th century, we do not have any documentation about the image cults that mention the existence of a native true image of Christ in the West. But in 1216, a miracle takes place at St. Peter's Square in Rome. In his Chronica Major, Matthew of Paris says that the image of Christ on the cloth was shown to pilgrims when it suddenly turned upside down. According to Pope Innocent III, the reversal of the image was a holy prophecy, and he composed a prayer that granted an indulgence of 10 days. Such an indulgence is still seen in the background of the portrait of a young man, and we saw this painting already by Petrus Christus, which is kept at the National in London. The image that turned upside down in Rome was from then on known as a sudarium, the sweat cloth of the Holy Veronica. The cloth was said to be 40 by 37 centimeters, and it was kept in a ciborium. The relic was said to be lost in 1527 during the Sacco di Roma. In his Speculum Ecclesiae, Gerald of Wales claimed, some say, that Veronica is a play on words, meaning the true icon. Actually, it is etymology derived from Berenike, the woman with the blood flow in Mark. Anyway, it is known that the apocryphal tradition of Veronica, who suited the face of Christ, as told in Jacobus de Voragine, Legenda Aurea, was widely spread in both text and imagery, and an incisive Western answer to the Mandylion of Abgar. During the Van Eyck's time, the Vera iconography had countless of variations on panels in the miniature arts and objects such as seals and pilgrim badges. We differentiate between the narrative iconography, depicted during the carrying of the cross, the front-facing iconic iconography, the isolated face of Christ, building on a strict Byzantine template, and a type in between where Veronica with the cloth is isolated from the narrative story. In this typology, the face of Christ itself shifts between a frontal Mandylion-fähig image and the suffering face that appeared on Veronica's cloth according to the Legenda Aurea. The Van Eycks were familiar with the far-reaching tradition of the true image. On the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, you can see a Vera icon souvenir with a typical Roman Genovese template on the left shoulder of one of the pilgrims, according to some Saint Eudochus. Such smaller parchment versions with dark templates of the Vera icon were also found in nunneries as loose parchments or as kusbilder in manuscripts. In short, Vera icon imagery were mobile, and badges were prevalent during that time in both private homes and artist studios. Some years after the adoration of the mystic lamb in 1438, and Till discussed this much more thoroughly than me. Sorry, Till, I will shorten my part on that. Jan van Eyck personally adds a fourth type to the iconographic genealogy. The panel, which is only known through copies of the original, shows a portrait of Christ that signifies a tipping point to a humanist interpretation of the archetypes of the Mandylion and the Vera icon. Van Eyck pushes the face of Christ just over the edge into the portrait genre. By giving Christ a neck and bust and by removing him from his archaic carrier, the sweatcloth, he becomes an individual. In Van Eyck's time, the individual features of Christ were spread through the so-called letter of Lentulus. You all know that. It's a 13th century apocrypha from Byzantium, which would refer back to a letter by Pilate to the Roman governor Publius Lentulus, which describes the face of Christ. The iconography of this crucial panel is in the hybrid space between humankind and the Son of Man, between portrait and acheropoietos. Jan van Eyck explores the medium of the painterly arts and what it is capable of. Paint is capax. Byzantine shadow and miraculous imprint become the possibilities of the paint itself. The incarnation of the Son of Man enveloped in oil and an artist creator able to activate this incarnation. The painterly arts are now unsurpassed in the reflection of their own essence. In this work, the roots of the figurative image found in Byzantium, iconogenetically charged with the magic of the acheropoietes, are tested to their limits in what one human hand and the finest brush possible are capable of. That is where and when it happens, at the end of an iconophilic journey that stretches between the alpha and the omega, the letters connected to the halo, and between the initium and the finis of the epigram on the frame, which is a quote from the book of Revelation 22. Robert Campin did a similar tour de force of paragone. Veronica not only shows Christ's image, clearly taking after the dark archetype of the Mandylion, she also shows the virtuosity of the painterly arts as such. The painter behind Veronica, so to speak, is capable of realizing the seemingly impossible. A completely diaphanous handkerchief, the 5 folds of the alleged folded Mandylion in Edessa still visible, and floating on top of that highly delicate textile, the image of Christ, he the Savior, looking almost amazed himself by this sheer amount of mimetic ability. Here, Veronica is the actual Verenike of the painterly arts. Her sudarium forms the mise en abîme of the medium itself, and her spiritual example competes with the artistic amazement over a shining, transparent gazatum, or gauze, which is a thin, translucent fabric with a loose, open weave, now miraculously woven from a brush. The lamp shares his act of looking out of the frame with 2 singing angels on the right-hand panel and with the Christ God of the Deises at the top panel. Regarding the Deises, the gaze is ambigu, at least for now, because phase 3 of the restoration has not yet given a definite answer to that query. And then I'm anxious to discover the specific nature of God's gazing and its specific direction here. Whatever is the case, and I ask myself the following experimental question, forgive me. Is there any kind of hierarchy to be found in the eye contacts between us and among these 3 emanations of the heavenly and divine here, the Lamb, angels, God, Christ? They look out of us. The road to ultimate beholding in the spirit is cumulative, or has been described since Augustine as the road to the spiritual seeing. The hierarchy and anagogue of seeing God is in exegetic conflict within 2 biblical texts, but, so we shall see, can be reconciled theological and exegetically. In Exodus 33, God says to Moses, "But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live." But with the coming of a visible Son of God, Paul says in his first epistle to the Corinthians, Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. Paul alludes to a typological transition from the Old Covenant into the New Covenant, which he further explained in his second epistle to the Corinthians. You are not like Moses, who put a veil over his face so the people of Israel would not see the glory, even though it was destined to fade away. But the people's minds were hardened, and to this day, whenever the Old Covenant is being read, the same veil covers their minds so they cannot understand the truth. And this veil can be removed only by believing in Christ. So all of us who have had that veil removed can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. The exegetic solution for the impasse, the disappearance of Moses' veil through spiritual seeing, is portrayed in the last folio of the Granvelle Bible in Tours, 9th century, and interpreted brilliantly by Herbert Kessler in his book Spiritual Seeing. The folio has two registers and depicts the book of Revelation. At the top, the closed book is flanked by the Lamb and the Lion of Judah after verse 5:1. The closed book is a well-known metaphor of the Old Testament, which shall be unlocked in the New Covenant. The total opening will only take place during the end of times. The lower half shows a gray-haired man on a throne. He holds a veil above his head and is flanked by the symbols of Matthew and Mark. The figure on the throne represents the fulfillment of Moses in Paul. As in Revelation 22 again is said, no longer will there be a curse upon anything, for the throne of God and of the Lamb will be there, and his servants will worship him, and they will see his face, and his name will be written on their foreheads. The triad in the biblical exegesis, Moses in Exodus, Paul in the Corinthians, and the Son of Man who appears in Revelations, is mirrored in the triple hierarchical side that has remained an enduring subject since the writings of and opinions of Pope Adrian I, and this until deep into the 15th century. First, there is a purely physical seeing. Then there is the seeing where one interprets words and images. And finally, there is a true, deep intellectual side. That seeing, the intellectual deep seeing, takes place in the mind, removed from the senses, such as line, color, sound, scent, or taste. And that is where God can be seen. According to Augustine, this seeing requires intellectual prowess to detach things from their material nature and thus to create room for the virtue of the purely spiritual. In the Greek language, the three different words remain. In Latin translations, we have only videre. But in the Greek, there is a lexical divided into this hierarchy. Blebo, physical perception, theoreo, observing attentively and intellectually, and horao, or heoraka, the transcendent seeing with the eyes of faith. During the Van Eyck's era, both the iconography of the true image of Christ and the exegesis surrounding the spiritual seeing are connected to our third pillar, the study of optics. Thanks to the recent studies by Marc de May and Maximilian Martens, we understand how the Van Eycks were able to connect the idea of, for example, the Beata Visio with the contemporary scientific insights about light and eyes. And since the vital work by Christian Trotman, we know that the desire to see God after death ran very deep in medieval and early modern times. The Vera icon was as popular as the Andachtsbild because it was a precursor with painterly means of the great visual happening. Beata Visio is connected to the remarkable phrase in the book that Mary holds in her lap during the Annunciation, De Visione Dei. Marc de May has a brilliant analysis of this detail. He says that the phrase refers to the desire for the Beata Visio and that the optics the Van Eyck used is aimed at introducing this precursor in the adoration of the mystic lamp through the obtained optical knowledge and the pictorial effects of light on all of creation. You may notice that the light source in the Annunciation lights up exactly that phrase in the book, which moreover is not a natural light source, and thus is meant to be the light of God, says de May. The world of the creation bathes in the wonder of God as a light source, and if this can also be rendered artistically, then the painterly arts offer prefigurative access to God himself. The pictorial light signifies the elusive, formless iconogenesis of the Acheropoietos, and in touching the world, that light also makes the plastic world possible through shadow, line, color, volume, shine. The treatise that Nicolas Cusanos wrote decades later, also under the title De Visione Dei, connects the iconographic and theological obsessions with the seeing of God and the painted pupil of an icon. Cusanos asked the monks, as you know, at a monastery near the Tegernsee to walk past the countenance of the Vera icon and look, the icon does not break eye contact. This is actually a simply painter's technique where one places the pupils in the center of the eyes, just as with the Mandilion, which had the same miraculous effect. For Cusanos, however, the trick becomes empirical evidence that seeing of God surpasses a single perspective, and this is absolute and infinite. What kind of eye contact does the audience experience when they view the adoration of the mystic Lamb? Is the audience optically, physically touched by the Lamb? Do they then travel upwards to meet the attentive gazes of the angels, to end with the ultimate ecstasy, touching with one's eye God himself? God himself in the deises, and thus becoming transcendent in the pure spiritual seeing of the Horao? Can we, through the Van Eyck's limitless mimesis, when it comes to the details and the light, reach the Beata Visio in the now? In this material world, the eye contact with God made observable in oils, the ultimate paragone, and these are true open questions. This is also the contemplative genius of the Van Eycks. They made métier, medium, mimesis, paragone, emulatio, exegesis, and spirituality all intersect with modern optics. That is how they become the painters who single-handedly dismantled through mimetic means Exodus 33 and opened the way for Paul's letter 1, a road indeed paved with gems, herbs, singing mouths, and touched by a sunbeam on a Virgin's Prayers book. Or as Astrid Hart and Frederica van Dam aptly describe it, basically, the mimesis principle undermined the contemplative function of religious depictions, but by perfecting the painterly illusionist techniques to depict optical phenomena that are connected to spiritual seeing, the Van Eycks gave the artistic mimesis doctrine and an allegorical dimension that facilitated the contemplative function of religious depictions, end quote. Isn't the natural lamp, with its correct pupil features, combined with the theological lamp and its bold artistic resonance of a human frontal gaze, not an incredible metaphor for the iconography of the altarpiece as a whole? And is a small black horizontal stripe of the pupil not pars pro toto for perhaps the world's most courageous and impressive restoration conservation team in the painterly arts? A dazzling black open pupil as mise en abîme, again, of the limitless capacities of human hands and the endless chain of possible meanings in one masterpiece. I will end now with a coda. Ladies and gentlemen, in the painterly arts, eyes do not blink. Not those of the animals, nor those of the humans. The front-facing gaze is forever frozen in the oil paint and draws its unending and apotropic power from it. This broader and deeper seeing of the lamp only came back to the surface after the restoration. There, from the center of the middle panel, the figure gazes out and musters, monsteren, actually also in Dutch, its yellow almond eyes to us. The lamp has surpassed its animal species, and thanks to the master, its tiny horizontal black slits of pupil give a glimpse, subtle but undeniable, of a psyche that is capable of answering our gaze. The Son of Man resonating in a lamb becomes the démarche of a vera effigies agni. There may be a second démarche. the blood that pours out of the chest of the lamb, associated to Yom Kippur, actually, very interestingly by Luc de Kweker. The wound leaks blood from the breast of the animal, not with a heavy flow that fills the Eucharistic chalice, but drop by drop in a messy, spotted fashion. The blood stains the white Immaculata altar cloths in tiny splotches, uncontrolled and almost coincidentally. But in the Van Eyck's painted world there, where the eyes do not blink, there is no such thing as accidental spills. The allegory of the Eucharistic sacrifice, the chalice, subtly branches off into an allegory of the Acheropoietos. The red imprint on textile, blood on the crisp white linen, images of potential as well as impregnation, the arrival of the figuration announced in a drop of blood, the incarnation already growing and theologically deeply hidden behind an undamaged white membrane. Look, the genius of the Van Eyck brothers live in a wound and in a pupil. The Mandilion and Sudarium united thanks to the horizontal prey animal lens that can see more than we do. The lamp can see both the East and the West at once. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for shedding such an interesting and fascinating light of the gaze of the probably most popular animal of 2020, I think, because we spoke a lot about this lamb of the Van Eycks.
Yeah.
So it was.
Stop share. Okay, sorry.
Since we are running a bit late, I suggest that we.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not you.
Okay.
It's always like that in any case. But maybe we can directly switch to Michele Bacci paper and then gather all the questions at the end of this second part of the morning session, if you both agree.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will now present the last speaker of this morning, Michele Bacci, who is professor of medieval art history at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland since 2011. From 1999 to 2002, he was a researcher at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, and he has also been associate professor at the University of Siena from 2002 to 2011. Since 2002, he is director of the journal Iconographica, and in 2017, he received the Hanno and Ilse Hahn Prize at the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. His main research interests are the materiality of the sacred and in its experience in space and image, as well as the artistic interactions in the Mediterranean Sea area. His two last books are entitled The Many Faces of Christ, portraying the Holy in the East and the West, from 300 to 1300, published in 2014, and also The Mystic Cave, A History of the Nativity Church in Bethlehem, published in 2017. Michele, you can now, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for the introduction and also for the invitation to this fascinating symposium. And do you see my shared screen?
Yes, it's perfect. Everything
Okay.
is...
So let's start. In the 15th and 16th century Venice, perhaps more than anywhere else, several attempts were made at working out a visual compromise between the expressive efficacy of pictorial narrative and the authoritative distinctiveness of religious icons. A Madonna painted by Jacopo Bellini in the 1440s was given a self-evident icon-like character via the abundant chrysography embellishing the hermaphorion, the child's attire, and the half-length presentation. At the same time, the animated posture attributed to Jesus, who's shown playing with a goldfinch, contributed to lay emphasis on his human nature as well. In his icon-like Madonnas, Jacopo thoroughly renounced to the evocation of space and decided to set up figures in a close-up composition against a dark black background. His son, Giovanni Bellini, and other painters of his generation went a step further in working out an intermediary solution that simulated the physical proximity of the holy ones while marking at the same time their belonging to a distinctive dimension. In several works, a balustrade separates the viewer from the Virgin and Child, whereas the curtain hanging behind Mary indicates that there is some space between her body and the golden background. In some further paintings, the icon-like appearance is conveyed exclusively by the half-length rendering of the body, shown as concealed behind the parapet and set against the blue sky, a natural landscape, or a black wall pierced with small windows. If such images aimed, on the one side, to update and rationalize the devotional icon in its basic features, on the other, the often displayed visual solutions that were far from traditional. The basic elements of a narrative scene, the new scheme inspired by Saint Birgitta's vision of the adoration of the child, were extrapolated to construct the half-length representation of Mary that prayed in frontal pose before the child laying on a marble balustrade, and the latter could thus be easily invested with a symbolic and visual association with the Lamentation slab and the Holy Sepulchre. Recently, the question has been aroused as to whether Bellini's attempts at updating and rationalizing the icon were successful or not. According to Alexander Nager and Christopher Hood, such creative adaptations could be suspected by many pious viewers to insufficiently embody or surrogate the authoritative prototypes they were meant to evoke. In other terms, this process led to an increased perception of the stylistic divide between Italian and Greek devotional images, and to a widespread preference for both archaizing copies and contemporary alla greca icons. The latter were mostly produced in the workshops of Venetian-ruled Candia, and the Serenissima exerted since 1436 a sort of monopoly in their Western European trade. Nevertheless, if it is a matter of fact that Cretan artists mostly shaped their images in keeping with Byzantine conventions, some of them shared in Bellini's commitment to working out innovative and modernized compositions. The Pietà type, for example, was a direct source of inspiration for Nikolaos Tsafouris in the late 15th century. An icon attributed to him, now in Geneva, is a direct copy of the Imago Pietatis with Mary and John, now in Berlin. The art intentionally emphasized the realistic, dramatic tone of his model without renouncing to making use of the typically Palaiologan modeling technique with a dark brown proplasmos highlighted with ochre and white brush strokes. In a triptych, now in the Hermitage, whose iconography is distinctively Western-oriented, he went so far as to reintroduce the marble parapet used by Bellini in his Brera painting from 1470 that rationalized the half-length presentation and evoked distance between the viewers and the holy ones. So Tsafouris' Pietà indicates not only that he had a fully updated knowledge of contemporary painting in the lagoon, but also that he and his contemporaries viewed Bellini's specific approach to the icon as worth pursuing and imitating. An icon that recently appeared in a Sotheby's auction bears witness to the engagement of late 15th century workshops of Candia in integrating Giovanni Bellini's modernized icons into the repertory of Cretan icon painting. It displays the Virgin adoring the child in a way that is clearly reminiscent of the Venetian scheme, even if a number of details betray the hand of a Greek-trained artist, e.g. the rendering of Christ's facial features and body proportions, or the flesh modeling of both figures. At the same time, it is clear that the artist aimed to evoke the background solution found in such works as the Brera Madonna, even if he either misunderstood or intentionally replaced the dark curtain with a golden surface and delimited it with two black vertical bands. In a slightly later work in the Museo Piersanti in Matelica, the golden background is abandoned in favor of a black one, the parapet is omitted, and two curtains are invested with the role of staging the close-up presence of the holy figures. Apart from the modeling technique, the stylized rendering of facial features and the child's tunic embellished with chrysography, all other details, Mary's reading posture, her white veil, the dark setting, and the hanging textiles, stem from contemporary Venetian painting. Even more meaningfully, Bellini's workshop was responsible for introducing the young St. John into icon-like half-length images. The Greek artist developed its models to such an extent as to strongly emphasize the mutual interaction of each figure, thus coming very close to the pictorial sensibility of his Italian contemporaries. Indeed, only the barely visible nomina sacra enabled viewers to sense that they were praying before an icon rather than a devotional image in the Venetian way. Undoubtedly, there existed less radical ways to harmonize the appearance of religious paintings with the new needs and expectations of contemporary believers. In an image painted in Otranto in 1532, Ioannis Permeniatis, a Cretan artist, reintroduced the hanging rectangular curtain and the landscape background while rendering the three figures in a strongly stylized way in both the modeling technique and the outlining of draperies. Another distinctive approach can be detected in the so-called Madonna delle Lacrime, once worshipped in the Dominican church of Santa Caterina in Fabriano and now in the town cathedral. Originally intended for a private setting, it was painted in a distinctively Greek style by a gifted Cretan artist working at the end of the 15th century. The solution it displays is clearly based on the Marian scheme of the Panagia to Pathos that had been popularized by Andreas Rizzos, but the gesture of displaying the instruments of Christ's Passion is here performed by just one angel instead of two. On the other hand, the image is structured in such a way as to direct the viewer's gaze from the top left to the bottom right, where the figure of the young St. John has been introduced. The intensity of interpersonal relationship between the three figures is here conveyed by the gesture of Jesus clasping his mother's thumb and hugging his cousin. The two children are no longer nude and wear the traditional chiton and himation. Furthermore, they are attributed facial features that look almost identical. In this way, a distinctively Italian motif is transformed into the visual alteration or expansion of a conventional and worship-inspiring Byzantine-like icon. The Matelica and Fabriano images can be regarded as two opposite poles in the painter's quest to reconcile the sensuous dimension of Bellini's and his followers' modernized icons and the authoritativeness of Greek religious painting, generally deemed to stem from its loyalty to long-established conventions, despite its evident sensitivity to the novelties of Renaissance arts. In multiple ways, Cretan artists adopted a selective and instrumental approach to styles, The extent to which they came closer to Italian models largely depended on the message they wanted to convey and the functional context of the figural object they were giving shape to. In many instances, the appropriation of Venetian motifs served to introduce narrative, dramatic, or affective nuances into the compositional structure of Byzantine-like icons. In this way, the traditional schemes were made more attractive to those pious beholders who, irrespective of their being Catholic or Orthodox, wanted their icons to arouse a more intensive sense of involvement in the visual dialogue with the holy persons. The great Cretan masters of the 16th century took great advantage from their ability to paint in bath manners. Their expertise enabled them to have a career in Western Europe, as in the case of El Greco, and explore new paths towards a deeper harmonization of Italian and Byzantine traditions. For Michele Damaskinos, shifting from a more naturalistic to a more stylized rendering of forms was largely a matter of emphasis. A look at his impressive adoration of the Magi from 1591 in the Museum of St. Catherine's in Heraklion is enough to acknowledge to what extent the two approaches to form and space could be combined with a more conventional Greek appearance reserved for the rocky landscapes and Joseph the angels and partly also the Virgin Mary, whereas Venetianizing devices were used to evoke the perspective of space of the stable, the three-dimensional presence of all figures in the Magi's parade, and the latter's animated postures. It is worth wondering whether and to what extent such experiments proved successful. Damaskinos' works were integrated into the thematic repertoire of icon painting and were therefore frequently reproduced, even if not infrequently, in a strongly stylized way that was no longer able to convey the emotional efficacy of its models. Sometimes different styles could coexist in the same work, but without mingling at all. In around 1604, a skilled contemporary of Damaskinos was requested by a Cypriot refugee in Venice, the protopapas Georgios, who had lost two of his sons, to make an icon displaying the enthroned Virgin Mary with St. Nicholas and St. George, but that was meant to visualize the donors and his family's quest for salvation in the afterlife. What is striking here is the distinctively post-Byzantine style relying on the repertoire of forms established in the previous century and including also motifs stemming from Trecento Italian arts, like the richly decorated throne. The palaiologan modeling of the nude parts of the bodies are developed in such a way as to provide them with a distinctively fleshy and plastic appearance. On the lower margin, the images of donors, all members of an Orthodox priestly family, were added. Significantly enough, preference was given to a different technique, oil painting, and a distinctively Tintorettesque manner. In this case, it can be assumed that different styles were used as visual markers of the distinctive divine versus human dimensions to which the holy figures and their supplicants belonged. Perhaps the most intriguing example of a devotional icon where Italian and Byzantine codes were intentionally combined in the aim to convey very specific messages is a triptych that was recently exhibited in the Morsing Icon Gallery in Amsterdam. When closed, it displays the scene of the Annunciation that was associated in the Orthodox world with the decoration of royal doors of iconostasis and could therefore remind viewers of the specific moment in which, through their opening, the space of the liturgical action was disclosed to the people attending the Mass. At the same time, the artist structured the image in such a way as to evoke the standard rendering of the event in Italian painting. The angel moves toward a very youngish Virgin Mary, kneeling and praying before an open book, whereas God the Father appears in the sky within a cloud with his blessing gesture serving as a signal for the descent of the Holy Spirit. Once opened, the viewer is confronted with a rather unusual composition. On the side wings, angels are shown in a deacon's garb, holding lit candles and waving censers, both turned toward the image of Christ displayed in the central panel. The Savior is represented according to the Megas Archiereos scheme, as is confirmed by the accompanying inscription. The Savior sits on a throne of cherubim and is flanked by the symbols of the four evangelists, each holding a book inscribed with the first words of the corresponding Gospels. He stands out for wearing patriarchal garments that lay emphasis on his priestly role. At the same time, the mitre on his head, stemming from the imperial camelauchion, hints at his role as King of Kings. As Titus Papamastorakis has shown, the special image type was worked out in the context of late Byzantine disputes that attempted at redefining the ecumenical patriarch as mediator of imperial power and representative of Christ on earth. In this sense, it can be understood as a visual embodiment of authority privileged by the Orthodox Church in those times. Given the perfect synchrony of this image with the political thought of Greek ecclesiastical scholars, its association with the kneeling figure of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V can prove surprising. The ruler of the two worlds is shown as an old-aged man wearing a long mantle highlighted with golden chrysography and embellished with ermine fur, over which lays the chain of the golden fleece. Close by are the imperial crown and the scroll inscribed with the words Carolus Quintus Imperator. The vestments of both the celestial and terrestrial emperors stand out for the dominant ochre color hinting at the golden surface, and they are both holding the same staff, topped with a cross and a flag, displaying the double eagle that served simultaneously as a symbol of the former Byzantine Empire, the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, and the Habsburg dynasty. The text inscribed in the book was basically inspired by Psalm 109 and reads roughly in this way: "Stand up, O king, and rule in the midst of your enemies, and make them the footstool of your feet. Indeed, I am with you." End of quote. The message could not be more explicit. Charles V is identified as the new David, receiving divine assurance for victory. In keeping with the overall meaning of the psalm, the ruler is invested with the role of priest according to the role of Melchizedek, verse 4, and accordingly he receives the staff of power that God sends him from the Holy Zion. The icon is clearly in keeping with the hope manifested by some members of the Greek Church that the Holy Roman Emperor may lead a new crusade against the Turks. Given that the ruler is attributed roughly the same physiognomy encountered in Titian's 1548 portrait in Munich, it can be easily assumed the triptych was painted around the mid-16th century. In the same years, Gianni Zazzaioli, the former governor of Coron and a descendant of the Acciaiuoli family of Florence, who had dominated Athens in the 14th and 15th century, wrote a poem in Greek exhorting Charles to reconquest Constantinople, whereas Dimitrios Blogas probably a member of the ecumenical patriarchate, tried to contact the Spanish court after John the Baptist had announced to him in an apparition that Charles had been elected by God as the new Constantine. The Amsterdam triptych, whose former history is unfortunately unknown, was undoubtedly meant to visualize the divine investiture of the Holy Roman Emperor as the legitimate heir to the Byzantine Basileus. It can be wondered whether it was made on the initiative of one of the two above mentioned authors as a diplomatic gift intended to persuade the sovereign to launch a new crusade. If this is the case, it clearly indicates that icons were regarded by Greeks not only as objects which could be used and appreciated also by Latins, but also as images whose visual conventions could be easily adapted in the aim to convey unconventional meanings dictated by devotional preferences, both individual and collective, and even by political circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Michele, for this very interesting paper, which I think offer a good point of comparison with the previous papers dedicated to the Low Countries, because it allows us to confront and compare the Flemish and Venetian strategies to adapt icons. And I also very liked the way you showed us how Cretan painters adapted Venetian models. So thank you very much. I now virtually turn to the public. Is there any questions? I don't see any written question, but I think that Ralph has one. So, okay.
Thank you, Ingrid. So thank you very much to Michele and to Barbara. That was indeed a very two very fascinating papers. And actually my question could be addressed to all of you, including Catherine and Till, because I think that we need probably a more precise terminology to qualify or to determine the type of adaptation of Byzantine style and iconography. We are facing a very large range of type of assimilation, from quite faithful copies to very slight or vague or superficial inspiration. And between these two extremes, we have different types of hybridization, so to speak. So could you share with us some insights about this question of typology of assimilation and the question also of the function and the goals of these type of assimilation? So I don't know who wants to start answering this very large question, I'm aware.
May
Michele?
I?
Yeah, sure.
Well, obviously, this is the most important question, if you want. So first of all, I had no time to speak about this, but we should keep in mind that the icon notion did not exist in the 15th century. So simply, to put it roughly, the notion icon does not exist in Greek. That should also be considered. Icon means image in the same ways as imago in Latin means any kind of mental, optical experience, basically. So in the research I made on the lexicography, let's say, and the fortune of the term icona in the West, basically it was used until the 12th century as a synonym for imago. So we find, for example, in the 9th century, some authors using icona for statues. So it's clear that there was no association with our idea of painted image. For the Byzantines themselves, I mean, painted icons were not necessarily the most solemn and appreciated way of glorifying the holy ones. So the most probably the appreciated metal icons and relief icons much more than painted icons. So basically, even in Byzantium, the preference for the painted medium occurs, first of all, in the late 13th and 14th centuries, so quite late. And we have some instance, some grounds to think that the association of the icon notion with a particular medium and with a particular composition, the half-length presentation, which was frequently evoked today, started in the West and not in the East. It was a basically Western European notion with, and perhaps the very first hint I was able to find is in the writings of Hugo St. Victor in the 12th century. When in describing his mystic arc, he says that the Greeks make use of eikones, meaning half-length figures. So he's the very first author who hints at this. But if you look at the terminology used even later, even in Trecento Italy, I mean, what is, let's say, most antithetic to Byzantium as Giotto in our present day perception? But for Petrarch, for example, the image of Mary, which was given to him by Giotto, was an icona. So for him, it meant a devotional image, but it was almost synonym with the devotional image. So if we take into account these shifts, I mean, even the perception of the stylistic divide is, in my view, extremely late. The very first clear instance I found of a clear perception of a Byzantine icon as being stylistically different from a Western one dates from approximately 1440, and it's in a Venetian source. It's the story, the very curious story of a lady who was severely ill, and she wanted to be assisted by the saint for whom she had a very special devotion. This was Saint Theodosia of Constantinople, so a pretty Byzantine saint. And he asked a Constantinopolitan friend to go to Constantinople and ask a painter there to make an icon, bring it to her, and because she wanted to pray before an icon. When this object came to Venice, and the Byzantine, the Greek friend, asked for to be paid, her husband was very disappointed because he said that the style of this image was so bad that he would have preferred to ask a Venetian painter to make a much better image of Saint Theodosia. So the Greek was not paid, but the illness of the lady became extremely bad. So finally the couple was forced to call back the Greek man with the icon, pay it 3 times its original price, and accept that miraculous efficacies could be associated only with an icon. A Venetian, a contemporary Venetian image was probably much more beautiful, but certainly less efficacious in devotional terms. So this text makes many things extremely clear, but from many viewpoints, it is evident that conscious awareness or stylistic distinctiveness was not so precise as to prevent contemporary Cretan artists to include a range of elements into the vocabulary of icon painting. So the permeability of both traditions was accepted, and probably, I don't know to what extent, both Greeks and Latins were interested in laying emphasis on stylistic distinctiveness. I don't know whether they were really if style was really a matter for them.
So we have to question our own categories. That's the point. Yeah. Thank you, Michele. Thank you.
Yeah, Michele, I think I didn't even probably just in passing mentioned icons. For me, it's more the venerable character and the reliquary qualities. So I speak of reliquary images, actually. I think this is probably a better term, and it's, yeah, we have to be cautious, of course, but I think regardless of how you call it, there is a clear understanding that these images coming or associated with the East are of a different quality, have a different authenticity than the images produced in, you know, the West. I think that is the cultural phenomena that we should be focusing on.
Yes, may I? Yeah, I think we basically agree, but if you think of the Liège Madonna, for example, which was completely repainted, I mean, it was not the, I mean, what we tend to identify as stylistic distinctiveness was not really in the center of their
concern,
of their worries, let's say. For them, probably it was much more important to lay emphasis on the specific materiality and on the repetition of some compositional schemes, which they saw as old-fashioned, as exotic, or I mean, but their perception of the exoticism was probably not the same as the one we may today associate with a Byzantine style. It's a matter of awareness. And if you see, one of the most important aspects, which also explains why an image could be modernized. They did not really have an antiquarian look. Their works. They found it, you know, they never imitated their models in a very strict, direct way, but they modernized them, they added, they made them living in some way, and also knowledgeable to their contemporaries in familiar, by using a familiar repertory of forms. So basically it's the general, what we call the composition, the structure, the materiality, the morphology of the icon that is displayed and emphasized, but this has normally not much to do with a specific imitation of style. Apart from generic, let's say, old-looking allure, but there is nothing philological, let's say, in this imitation.
Ton micro, Ingrid, ton micro.
Ah oui, pardon, sorry. So thank you very much. I see there are two questions in the Q&A tool for Barbara. I read them. The first one is, do I have it right that the eyes of the Lamb in the Adoration of the Lamb of Van Eyck are put this way to show that the divine perspective is not the human perspective, and that the divine can combine all perspectives together, and that with the heavenly vision of God in the afterlife, we will share this perspective with which the angel in the panel already shown by looking in every direction. It's a question from Nicolas Van Est.
Thank you, Nicolas. That is even stronger and more radical formulated than I would dare to do it. My text is still in process. Huh? It started with an idea. I saw the new lamb, and what popped up in me was it's a Vera icon. Huh? And I tried to develop this in the text you heard. I think you understood rightly, and I want to emphasize in my text, I think that the frontwards gaze is filtered by theological, exegetical, and optical means, that it was, yes, on purpose, that it was not a coincidence, that the eyes had to look forward like that.
Barbara, I think this is...
The sheep is different. The sheep has different eyes.
Yes, still...
Just because I must say, I found that, in fact, rather fascinating, and you can and you should probably argue that you have a formal parallelity between the figure of Christ or Godfather, you know, in the upper tier.
Yes.
And, yeah, and I come back with my little dada with the ears, yeah, because the Christ in the Ghent altarpiece is a listening Christ. And if you look, you know, it's not only the gaze that is pronounced in the lamp, but also a rather prominent way of actually displaying ears.
Exactly, indeed.
Right? I
Thank you, Till.
An interesting point to make, but you know, because it's all about intercession upstairs. You know, this is you have Mary with the open lips. You have Saint John the Baptist with open lips, and then you have this really
there is activity. There is activity indeed. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. I will work on the text, and I will be more precise on the terminology, thanks to Michele. I wrote this down, and think about the verticality, and also which I like very much is, of course, the panels that have sound. It's also auditive. Yeah. Yeah. I can do something with that. Thank you, Tim.
Of course you can.
There is another question for Barbara from Caroline Morrison. Was Nicholas of Cusa the first to use the terminology of the omnivoyant gaze, all-seeing God?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think he was the first who developed it on the basis of a painting on materiality. I have to check that, Caroline. Thank you for that. Maybe somebody else knows. You mean the impact of the frontal gaze as an all-enveloped seeing of the whole? Yeah, I think Nicolas of Cusa was the first.
He's the one who usually gets quoted. Right?
Yeah, I know. And we all do. I did it again. I will double check that for the text. Thank you to this person, to this lady.
Thank you. Is there any other question? I don't see any in the Q&A or in the conversation tool. So I think this will end our morning session. I would like to thank again all the speakers of this morning for these fascinating papers and discussions that we had. And so it's a little bit strange. We will go eat all by ourselves. But we will meet again here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for the afternoon session, which will be moderated by Ralph. So I see you later. Bon appétit, smakelijk eten en tot straks then.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good conference. Bye.